They're looters and rioters. And then you hear the Democrats, they never say anything bad about them. Even Biden in his speech, he never mentioned the words law and order, never mentioned the word police.
There's a lot of folks who thought that, well, the president's made great strides with his law and order strides here. That boy, after his convention, he really made inroads. He hasn't. Not at all. No, I'm not serious. I'm being. It should give you a little bit of confidence in the American people. They ain't buying it.
Joe Biden in Kenosha, Wisconsin today. The family of Jacob Blake, through attorney Ben Crump, said Vice President Biden and Dr. Joe Biden today had a very engaging 90-minute in-person meeting with the Blake family. The family was grateful for the meeting and was very impressed that the Bidens were so engaged and willing to really listen. They talked about the changing and disparate treatment of minorities in police interactions, the impact of selecting Kamala Harris as a black woman as a running mate, and Vice President Biden's plans for change. It was very obvious that Vice President Biden cared as he extended to Jacob Jr. a sense of humanity, treating him as a person worthy of consideration and prayer. Talking directly to Jacob Blake by phone. Let's bring in our panel. Charles Lane, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Kimberly Strassel, a member of the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal. Jonah Goldberg, editor-in-chief of the Dispatch. Kimberly, your thoughts on the former vice president's trip to Kenosha today and perhaps the contrast to the president's trip yesterday?
Well, to me, first of all, it's notable that he's in Wisconsin and that he's addressing these issues, because those are two things that the campaign weren't willing to do a couple of weeks ago when they had a virtual convention and they didn't really want to talk about this subject. So when you change strategy, it means that you are worried in some way. Despite Joe Biden saying that he doesn't think the president is making inroads on the law and order thing, the fact that he's out there doing it suggests that Democrats are worried. And we'll see where that goes. But I think it's something that he's going to have to address, because people will keep watching TV, and there's no longer any more denying that this is becoming a huge problem in cities and suburban communities across the country.
The Trump campaign's response, also a written statement saying Joe Biden made a political trip to Kenosha today, his first visit to Wisconsin after months of saying he could not travel because of the science of the coronavirus. What changed was political science, as he knows he's in a serious decline in the polls. To top it off, people participating in his church meeting in Kenosha were handed scripts to read from during the public comment period, proving again that Biden's handlers don't trust him in uncontrolled situations. Nevertheless, Americans didn't hear any denunciation of Antifa or any other left-wing agitators who have rioted in American cities from coast to coast. Said nothing about Wisconsin Governor Evers' acceptance of federal assistance from President Trump to quell the riots, and did not explain that he opposed calling in the National Guard to protect Americans from violent left-wing rioters. Joe Biden made this above-ground excursion from his basement for purely political reasons, and it shows. We thought we'd read both statements. Chuck, your thoughts?
Well, that was certainly a political statement. I mean, the president is a little not been emphatic in denouncing certain right-wing people, and found a way to kind of, attenuate what Kyle Rittenhouse did up there. But look, this is, I think, an effort by Joe Biden to get back to what he started, which was as a peacemaker. Remember, the image he evoked at that time was Charlottesville, the terrible violence. We thought that was the worst it could be, right? And we found out it wasn't. That terrible conflict, between right and left, where ultimately some of the people on the liberal side, one of them was killed by a right-wing person driving a car. And so I think this is, in his view, the strength of his campaign. He is viewed as somebody who's more peaceful, more unifying, more stabilizing. At least that's how he got into this thing. And I think this is him taking an opportunity to get back to the team he started with.
Jonah, clearly the law and order issue seems to be playing in different communities. The president's on his way to Pennsylvania. There has been a shift there, but the polls pretty much are the same place that they have been overall, if you look at all the key battleground states.
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree with both Kim and Chuck in different aspects of this. I mean, on the one, and also on the Trump campaign statement. Of course, Joe Biden is in Wisconsin for political purposes. he's running for president of the United States. He's not going to travel anywhere that isn't for a political purpose right now. And neither, frankly, is Donald Trump. So I don't think that lands too hard. But where I think Kim is right is that the law and order message has some purchase, and not as much as the Trump campaign thinks it does. But the simple fact is that Joe Biden was a little slow in anticipating that this was something that he would have to respond to. And I actually think his statements have been pretty good on this stuff. He's condemning violence. He's not using the language that the Trump campaign wants him to use, nor is Donald Trump using the language that the Biden campaign says he should use. And so I think that ultimately where we are is this has been one of the most stable races in modern memory. Joe Biden's lead has been remarkably stable. Donald Trump's base has been remarkably stable. And I really think at this point, the only thing that we can plan on really shaking the numbers in a significant way are the debates, because the conventions didn't do it.
All right. The other news today that seemed to be a part of the market slide, perhaps, was the vaccine talk and whether there's going to be a vaccine at the end of November or end of October, beginning of November. Here is the White House and Tony Fauci, Kimberly.
Dr. Fauci said there is no political pressure that I have seen at all to move quickly. This president wants to break through regulatory barriers to get a vaccine as safely to the American people as quickly as possible, because lives are at stake.
If there is the kind of thing that people are concerned about, it'll become public sooner or later. So I think that we can have some confidence and have faith in what the FDA is saying. They're saying very explicitly that they're going to be making the decision based on the scientific data, and we hope that that's going to be the case.
Yeah, so he's being asked about the fact that would there be political considerations in getting a vaccine out before Election Day, Kimberly?
Yeah, so this comes from this theory that you've been hearing increasingly on the left, that there is political pressure to rush the vaccine and therefore it will not be safe. That doesn't take into account the realities of the fact that the vaccines have already been through safety trials. You're looking at questions of efficacy at this point and how good they are. And is there political pressure to get this out? Yes, mostly because they're still dealing with a pandemic and it's having a terrible consequence on the economic and personal lives of millions of Americans. Would it be politically good for the White House to also have it out sooner rather than later? Yes, but as Dr. Fauci has said, and no one has provided any evidence otherwise, this seems to be being driven so far very much on the scientific merits.